So hello friends, so today I'll be talking on this topic acute kidney injury. So this is just a brief overview for all the young trainees on how to approach a case of acute kidney injury and general outline about diagnosis, management and stratifying the risk factors. So the topics that I would cover is the definition of acute kidney injury. So there are two definitions that are commonly used. So one is the rifle criteria, one is the Akin criteria. So both are fairly similar to each other. So Akin would be a little more easier for us to incorporate in our practice. The second one we would look is acute kidney injury risk. What is its risk in ICU? Because ICU patients are the ones who would be at a higher risk for AKI, and what are the variables that predict to us that they are at a much higher risk of developing AKI, and what are the variables which are predictive in nature. The third most important one is we understand that hypertension is the commonest cause of acute kidney injury due to various reasons. So, what is the right map, mean arterial pressure, that one needs to attain or achieve to prevent AKI or to optimize kidney function? So, we'll just briefly look into etiology and pathophysiology. So, we'll look into investigations and what are the newer AKI, acute kidney injury biomarkers that are available. So we'll look at intra-abdominal pressure and very briefly about renal replacement therapy and take-home message. So when you look at the rifle criteria, which is commonly used to diagnose AKI, so rifle is an acronym which stands for risk, injury, failure, loss, and end stage. So risk is where any patient where creatinine is greater than 1.5 times. So as you see, rifle takes GFR. So Akin does not take GFR. So our GFR has dropped to more than 25%, or urine output less than 0.5 ml per kg for more than 6 hours. So any patient who categorizes into this would fall in a risk of developing acute kidney injury. So if you look at Akin criteria, they retain pretty much similar with urine output and creatinine. So just pay attention to creat and urine output. Injury is where creatinine is greater than 2 times and the fall in GFR is more than 50%, and urine output, I think this is important for all of us to uh, possibly try to remember. Urine output less than 0.5 ml per kg for more than 12 hours. So the longer the duration of oliguria, so the higher is the risk of them developing acute injury. So we call it as a failure when the creatinine is more than 3 or urine output is less than 0.3 ml per kg for more than 24 hours. So I think that is where you start getting really worried, or anuria more than 12 hours where GFR is dropped to more than 75%. So loss is where there is complete loss of kidney function for more than 4 weeks. We consider it as a loss. So in acute kidney injury, as we know, there is a possibility of a recovery even after the loss up to 4 to 6 weeks. So we call it as a end stage where there is absolutely no hope when there is no improvement in the kidney function for more than 3 months. So this is the rifle criteria that we tend to follow. But the easier one would be the Akin criteria. So as you see, Akin is very similar to rifle, but it has taken away the GFR. So stage 1, Akin is categorized into stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Stage 1 is where creatinine is more than 1.5 times or jump of creatinine more than 0.3 milligram per deciliter, and urine output remains the same, less than 0.5 ml per kg for 6 hours. Stage 2 is again same as rifle criteria where fall in urine output is less than 0.5 ml for 12 hours. Creatinine is more than 2. That is also very similar to rifle criteria. And stage 3 is again same as rifle criteria where creatinine is more than 3 or more than 4, more than 0.5 in acute, and urine output is less than 0.3 ml per kg in 24 hours. So if you remember this urine output, these are very similar to the rifle criteria, and creatinine also is pretty much similar to the rifle criteria. So that is, if you remember that much, that should be good enough. So both are pretty much similar, and Akin is more easier for us to use. So what is the risk of AKI in ICU? So what has been increasingly found is across the, uh, if you look at the global statistics, this is an Australian paper, the risk of AKI in ICU has been steadily increasing because of the elderly population with lot more comorbid conditions getting admitted to ICU. So these are some few studies. If you look, this is a study from UK where 5 to 7% of the patients who develop acute kidney injury need renal replacement therapy, and 7 to 13% of the sepsis patients who develop acute kidney injury end up needing renal replacement therapy. And what is important is they have looked at mortality between different risk groups. So if there is no dysfunction, mortality is less. So there is a linear correlation with the worsening kidney function to the mortality. If you see one in a patient is at injury level, they have a mortality of 11 to 30%. But once they go on RRT, the mortality goes up to 26 to 47. So this is extremely important for all trainees to remember that in ICU it's very common to, it's not uncommon to see patients with lot of problems and on dialysis. So you should be able to possibly counsel the family saying just because the fact they're on dialysis, the risk of dying will be up to 40%. Just because, so someone with AKI needing dialysis itself will push the mortality up to 40%. I think it is important for trainees to keep this in mind when we are counseling, because just because someone is on dialysis, it means that patient is very safe. It does not mean that patient is safe. It means that patient is vulnerable. Mortality independently has gone up to 40%. And that you see it even in the US study. So when they're on renal replacement therapy, mortality, 4% of them were in renal replacement therapy and mortality was 60%. So you can keep this figure in mind. So any of the patient in ICU who is needing dialysis for acute kidney injury, the risk of dying can be anywhere between 40 to 60%. So it's a very important dysfunction, and we need to have some sort of a correlation with mortality in our mind when we are counseling the family. And even if, based on these two studies, it is suggested that acute AKIN criteria helps in early recognition of AKI. And by using AKIN criteria, I think the incidence of AKI was somewhere between 1 to 25% was the occurrence rate of acute kidney injury. So now the question is, can we predict which patients in ICU? This is a very pictorial representation of all the typical variables in ICU that we would have patients with who develop acute. So there are about 9 variables which can predict in ICU that they are at a risk of AKI, and the most commonest is age. So we have elderly patients coming to ICU who are at a risk for AKI, and in ICU we get patients with hypovolemia. In ICU we get patients with sepsis. So these are all common ICU conditions which predisposes someone to develop AKI, and hypotension is a common one. And anyone developing any cardiac intervention like surgery or angioplasty, all that pushes them at a risk for AKI. And someone who receives radio contrast, for any CT, because in ICU typically we would be doing a lot of CTs with contrast, that pushes people into AKI. And diabetes, someone with diabetes admitting to ICU itself is a risk factor. Again, this is a very common comorbidity we see in our ICU patients, or someone with a pre-existing renal failure or rhabdomyolysis. So these are just a pictorial representation of 9 important variables in ICU which tend to predispose a patient to develop AKI. And there is a recommendation from expert panel that these factors should be looked into in a patient who comes to ICU, and specific preventive measures have to be taken in a preemptive way. And meticulous management of all this hypovolemia, sepsis, hypotension, and rhabdomyolysis, all these have to be addressed to prevent worsening of renal failure. So now the second question is, now having said that hypertension is an important risk for acute kidney injury, so what is the map that we should have in mind to aim to prevent AKI? So they have done studies. So this is a very important study in sepsis called SEPSI-PAM study, which came from the French group, where they compared high low blood pressure versus target blood pressure in patients with septic shock. So here they had two groups, one with a map of 65 to 70 and another one with a higher map, 80 to 85. So they looked at 28-day and 90-day mortality. There was no difference between lower map and higher map group. But in patients who had chronic hypertension, where the group was maintained at a map of 65 to 70, they had a twofold increase in creatinine, which means in someone who is a chronic hypertensive, maybe it is desirable to maintain higher map. And in chronic hypertension, when you maintain a map of this, the risk of them going into RRT was higher. So this is something you can keep in mind. If someone is a hypertension, maybe it is desirable to have a little higher map. But if it's non-hypertensive, so map of 65 to 70 may be reasonable. So, and both did not have any bearing on the mortality. So these are other 4 studies which they have looked into. So these are all from these different studies from countries. So this was 4 studies where they looked at map of 85 and 65. So they found in patients who had a map of 85, cardiac output increased, but when they looked at urine output and creatinine clearance between the map of 85 and 65, there was no difference in this particular study from French group. And this was another study from the US group where they tried to maintain high, they tried to normalize the mixed venous oxygenation and increase the oxygen delivery. They found there was no difference in AKI even after having increased the cardiac output or mixed venous saturation. They did not see any difference in the acute kidney injury. So basically, these studies tell you that MAP of 65 or 85 did not really matter having a bearing on AKI. So now the question remains: is there a role of low dose dopamine? Because we had this earlier thought that low dose dopamine will help in preventing acute kidney injury. Now this is out. So low dose dopamine, what they found is it can increase the diuresis on day one, but that it does not prevent acute kidney injury. And these meta-analysis and randomized controlled trials have shown that it does not give any protective benefit. And in fact, this was a Canadian study which showed in patients with acute kidney injury, if you use dopamine, basically there can be worsening of renal perfusion and renal function. Okay, so that's what they showed. So now we'll just look into etiology and pathophysiology of acute kidney injury. So if you look at this glomerulus, it has afferent arteriole, efferent arteriole. So the commonest etiology of acute kidney injury is in acute situation would be circulatory disturbance. So someone having hypovolemia or hypotension. So they cause hypoperfusion at the afferent arteriole and efferent arteriole, leading to kidney injury. And you can have obstruction within the tubules with myoglobin or cells or CAS, which can lead to acute kidney injury. Or you have a post-obstructive cause where you have an obstruction in the flow of urine outside due to calculi or prostatic hypertrophy or malignancy or retroperitoneal fibrosis, which basically causes obstruction to the outflow of the urine, so leads to back pressure and leads to acute kidney injury. So there are pre-renal. So the commonest is pre-renal in ICU, which is hypovolemia and hypotension. And then you have renal components, which can be presence of all these heavy cells and CAS within the tubules. And there is a post-renal, which is obstructive causes. Then there are a lot of other drugs which can cause acute kidney injury by acting on the efferent arterioles. So we know that patients who are on ACE inhibitors, there can be vasoconstriction of the efferent arteriole leading to acute kidney injury. Then there are a lot of drugs which acts on the afferent arteriole, like you have contrast media, amphotericin, or you have adrenaline, noradrenaline, which can also cause severe vasoconstriction and reduce the renal perfusion and lead to acute kidney injury. So this is just a pictorial representation of pre-renal, renal, and post-renal causes of AKI. So now patient having developed AKI, how do we go about assessing the AKI? So we need to assess, first one is the etiology of AKI, and then we need to ascertain the severity of AKI. So the important way to go about is urine examination becomes very important to determine the cause of acute kidney injury. So when we look into urine, we need to see whether there is any cast formation within the urine, whether there is presence of a lot of proteinuria in urine, or presence of a lot of WBCs in urine, or presence of RBCs. And so all these indicate certain pathophysiological aspects of them developing AKI. So if there is a lot of proteinuria, then there is some nephropathy. So if there is a lot of WBC, there is some infection which may be predisposing to infection. So when there is a lot of red blood cell or CAS, it means there is some sort of glomerulonephritis happening. So urine examination and interpreting the urine becomes very important in understanding the cause of acute kidney injury. Then we do a lot of urine biochemistry, which gives clue into whether the cause of AKI is pre-renal or renal. So osmolality is the easiest test you can do. If it is more than 500, it is pre-renal. Less than 350, it is renal. You can look at urine sodium. Less than 10 is pre-renal. More than 20 is renal. And you can look at all these other derived variables. So the easiest for you to remember would be urine osmolality, urine sodium, and fractional excretion of sodium to determine whether the cause of AKI is pre-renal or renal. So now, are these indices really would it determine or would it help you guide whether the patient is developed AKI? So what has been referenced is in 0 to 24 hours, in the first 24 hours, it is very hard to differentiate the cause of acute kidney injury between pre-renal acute kidney injury and renal. So it is very hard to ascertain whether the cause is pre-renal or renal, and there is no pathophysiological validity to delineate and say this is pre-renal and renal. So in sepsis, oliguria may be the only early indicator to indicate to us that there is an AKI that is setting in, and all those biochemical parameters may not be of much value in sepsis early on. And what has been re-emphasized is acute kidney injury is a dynamic process, and there is a continuation of an ongoing injury which eventually leads to AKI. So it is a continuum of process, and maybe in first 24 hours it is very hard for any of us to delineate that the cause is pre-renal or renal. So it may be a lot of complex interplay between renal, pre-renal factors which lead to AKI. So that is what this slide elucidates. And along with that urine biochemistry you saw, along with that urine routine you saw, there are certain special tests that may be needed to determine the cause of AKI. So the special test would be if you see RBC CAS, then obviously your suspicion is there is a lot of vasculitis that is happening. Then you may have to do some autoimmune workup like P ANCA, C ANCA to look for ANA profile or complement levels to determine whether there is an autoimmune process. So these are additional special tests to determine remote causes of AKI. Or you may have to do CPK if you are thinking of rhabdomyolysis. Then you may have to look at calcium if you are looking about into neoplastic features where hypercalcemia may be causing AKI, or magnesium, phosphorus, or uric acid. So these are all some of the uh, biochemistry chemical variables that you will be looking at to determine any other causes of acute kidney injury. And any elderly people with any lytic lesions, obviously you would have to look at serum electrophoresis to rule out any paraproteinemia or multiple myeloma as a cause of AKI. And you can do some special tests which are called biomarkers like urine NGAL, so neutrophil gelatinase associated lipocalin, to determine whether this patient could possibly go into AKI. So that I will talk in the next slide. So there are a lot of biomarkers. So if you see, these are three groups of biomarkers. So there are biomarkers to determine whether AKI is due to glomerular dysfunction, and the commoner biomarker we see is cystatin C for glomerular injury. And there are biomarkers to determine if there is any tubular dysfunction, and the commonest one we use is NGAL. In tubular dysfunction we look for NGAL, and for glomerular dysfunction the commonest biomarker that is available which we see is cystatin C. So these are the two commoner ones which we use to determine or to diagnose AKI. And the advantage of biomarker is it will help you to identify different stages of acute kidney injury, and it also helps us to recognize any subclinical AKI. So which means creatinine may be normal and blood urea may be normal, and maybe urine output also they may not have gone to a oliguria or anuria. But by doing these biomarkers we may be in a position to pick up AKI much earlier on before a complete manifestation happens. So that is the advantage of these AKI. And there was a study to that effect which was done. As you see, this was a study from Germany where biomarker was positive like cystatin or NGAL was high but creatinine was normal, but still it showed correlation to them having developed AKI later with increased ICU length of stay, hospital length of stay, increased complication, and increased mortality. So that is the advantage of. So basically, your biomarkers have ability to pick up AKI at a much earlier stage, even before it is manifested by rise in creatinine. So that is an advantage of biomarkers. So the 10th acute dialysis quality initiative, which is the quality improvement in AKI, has shown they recommend that biomarkers to determine functional damage and tubular damage has to be done along with conventional RFTs to define and characterize AKI. So this is the quality recommendation that one needs to look into, although blood urea creatinine as an index, along with it biomarker has to be done to determine what is the pathophysiological aspects of AKI, to define and characterize AKI, and this will help in delineate AKI spectrum and helps in diagnosis and the treatment of these AKI patients in a much better way. So the recommendation is predominantly, as I mentioned, with the cystatin C and NGAL. Cystatin C, as you saw, will look into the glomerular problem, and NGAL looks into the tubular dysfunction. And the other advantage of these AKI biomarkers is they are not dependent on age, and they are not influenced by the gender, they are not influenced by the liver disease or by the muscle dysfunction, so rhabdomyolysis or any of that. So which means it is a reasonably good sort of a marker which could be utilized. So now how do we monitor? So having diagnosed someone with AKI, so we need to see how they progress, because I said AKI is a continuum process. It is not a static that you see creatinine as it won't remain like that. It is a continuous progression of the disease. So how do we monitor? Obviously, we monitor by serially monitoring the creatinine, serially monitoring the urine output, and obviously we look into the history and look into the clinical exam, whether patient is developing short of breath, whether he is getting uremic. Then obviously we would look into hemodynamic parameters, whether he's hemodynamically stable. Then we would follow up with doing arterial blood gases, look into all the electrolytes, sodium, calcium, serum magnesium, phosphorus. Then we would look into hemogram and peripheral smear, because anemia can be a manifestation of chronic kidney disease. And you have conditions like thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura or HUS, hemolytic uremic, where peripheral smear becomes important, because we look into the schistocytes to see if AKI is due to hemolytic uremic or TTP. Then obviously we need to do echocardiogram to assess cardiac status, because if someone has a low cardiac output, that may be leading to AKI. So we need to monitor the cardiac function with echocardiogram to optimize cardiac function if there is a cardiac dysfunction. And we would do new AKI biomarkers, and obviously we would look into any drugs that may be worsening the kidney function. So this is the spectrum. So any patient with AKI, it's not like we just keep monitoring creatinine or urine output. It is a combination of all this that we would be looking into a patient to optimize and improve the outcome from AKI. And in addition to all this, there is another important thing we check at, which is intra-abdominal pressure monitoring. Because if there is intra-abdominal hypertension, AKI will not revert. So we need to address intra-abdominal hypertension. So what is intra-abdominal hypertension? So whenever there is a high intra-abdominal pressure, so their pressure in the abdomen increases, so the perfusion to the kidney gets affected. So we call it as renal perfusion pressure. So renal perfusion pressure is mean arterial pressure minus 2 into intra-abdominal pressure. And it is important to maintain mean arterial pressure with vasopressors. If it is a cardiac, you may have to use a balloon pump. And if intra-abdominal pressure is high, we need to relieve the pressure by medical treatment or by surgical parameters. So how do we check intra-abdominal pressure? So intra-abdominal pressure, as you see, grade 1 is 12 to 13, so it should be less than 12. And grade 2 is 16 to 20, grade 3 is 21 to 23, and grade 4 is more than 25. So the commonest way we check the intra-abdominal pressure is through the bladder pressure or the intravesical pressure. So basically we have a urinary catheter coming out of the bladder, which is connected to a three-way tube. So one is connected to the urine bag, one is connected to the pressure transducer. So we put 25 ml of water or saline into the bladder and block it and pressure transduce it, and we get the pressure. And the expert recommendation is for any patient with AKI with abdominal pathology of anything, we need to monitor intra-abdominal pressure. All high-risk patients where you sort of suspect there is intra-abdominal pathology, abdominal pressure has to be monitored. And if there is an abdominal compartment syndrome, when we say it's abdominal compartment syndrome, when intra-abdominal pressure is high along with organ dysfunction that is setting in, then we have to initiate treatment. And one of the simple thing is to keep an eye on the fluid status, because lot of fluid resuscitation can lead to abdominal compartment syndrome. Or you have to look at simple things. If there is ascites, we may have to drain out the ascites. If there is a chronic constipation or a bowel obstruction, that has to be relieved, or laparotomy to relieve abdominal pressure. So this is also a very important component to address AKI. So intra-abdominal pressure also is one of the components. And so we have to decompress the abdomen with surgical intervention. So if sepsis is the cause of AKI, then obviously we need to address this with appropriate antibiotics. Just giving antibiotics in sepsis is not good enough. Most important is source control. So we need to identify what is the source of sepsis, because if there is a CVC line or any external line sitting causing sepsis, we need to pull out the line. Or if it is a obstructive uropathy, then we have to put DJ stenting. So if there is a pus sitting somewhere, we need to drain. So source control becomes very important. I think this we deliberated. Renal dose dopamine studies have really failed to show any benefit for any good outcome with using low dose dopamine. So so now our cardiology colleagues love dopamine. I think they have also moved away from using dopamine. Why we have to dissuade them from using dopamine? Because this came from this SOAP study. So if this came from the French group, So this they looked at the use of dopamine in sepsis, and what they found is, if you see, this is the curve. The broken line one is dopamine. Survival was found to be low in patients where dopamine was used in compared to the no dopamine group. So dopamine, by using dopamine, it can even worsen their survival, or it can even worsen their mortality. So that was shown in this SOAP study, which came from the German group. So if our cardiology colleagues are not convinced, so this was a meta-analysis which again came from the Belgian group, where again you see that if you look at the forest plot, it favored noradrenaline as compared to the dopamine in the treatment of septic shock. So in septic shock, there is absolutely no role for using dopamine, because we know survival also is low with the use of dopamine, and this meta-analysis also shows that dopamine has no superiority, and all the studies favor noradrenaline. So if still that is not convincing, this is an important study which looked into all types of shock. It looked into hypovolemic shock, cardiogenic shock, septic shock. In all the types of shock, it was shown that noradrenaline was much superior to dopamine. So it's about time, in any types of shock, noradrenaline is found to be superior to dopamine. So we should really dissuade anyone, any specialties that is continuing to use dopamine. So now another controversial area is about the use of diuretics in AKI. So the role is controversial. So we do tend to use diuretic to convert from oliguric phase to non-oliguric phase by giving a big dose of diuretic. But it has not shown to alter the course of renal injury if you look at the core evidence. And sometimes diuretics can be used if you have a AKI who's developing fluid overload. Obviously, diuretics may have a role. And when we are using uh, higher dose of diuretics for a protracted period of time, one should be aware of the adverse effects of the diuretic therapy. And whilst you are using diuretic, you should not be in a comfort zone that patient may be getting better, where the urine output may be dwindling. So we have to keep a close eye and initiate them on RRT if their urine output is not improving with diuretics. So albeit diuretics can be tried, but one should keep in mind that there are side effects that are involved with using high dose of diuretics. And the second thing is not to delay definitive renal replacement therapy by using a diuretic and waiting till the patients would deteriorate. So again, to look into certain treatment factors, obviously the steps that you would take to avoid ongoing kidney injury is look into the pre-renal factors. So sepsis, if there is a sepsis, address the sepsis and do effective source control. If there is rhabdomyolysis, treat it and interrupt. So these are just an outline of all the key elements that you would bear in mind. And look for increased uric acid, because uric acid also may be an indicator that patient is developing some tumor lysis syndrome if they have underlying some malignancy. And most importantly, avoid all nephrotoxic drugs to prevent worsening of AKI. So now, having done all the good things, so you have treated sepsis well, you have taken care of hypovolemia, you have maintained good MAP, and then you have looked into all other variables that may be contributing. You have looked at nephrotoxic. Still, patient has deteriorated. And when would you say that patient needs RRT? So patient needs renal replacement therapy. There are certain absolute indications, and then there are relative indications. Absolute indication is any patients with hyperkalemia in the setting of acute kidney injury needs dialysis, or severe metabolic acidosis, they need dialysis. So these are all absolute indications. Or patients with acute kidney injury where they are gone into fluid overload or pulmonary edema, they need dialysis. Or someone who is not passing any urine, oliguria or anuria, or patient has developed uremic symptoms, or there is a known drug toxicity, high toxicity which has led to acute kidney injury. So these are the absolute indications for renal replacement therapy. So there are other relative indications, like patient who is grossly, like typical septic shock, who are hemodynamically very unstable. So we may have to initiate dialysis, or where there is gross fluid imbalance, like typically end stage heart failure or end stage liver failure. So where there is a lot of fluid anasarca or lot of fluid logging. So that's where we may have to do CRRT, or sepsis patients, rhabdomyolysis or electrolyte abnormalities. So these are all the relative indications for dialysis or renal replacement therapy. So now coming to the last part of my talk. So now you have decided that your patient needs RRT because of those absolute indications. So what are the modalities of renal replacement therapy a trainee should have in mind? So there are basically two types of dialysis. One is hemodialysis, one is hemofiltration. So hemodialysis is, there is, if you see pictorially here, in hemodialysis there is diffusion of solutes, so from one compartment to another. In hemofiltration, there is a convection. What do we mean by convection? In convection, along with the solutes, so if you see along with the solutes, there is a movement of water also. So solutes go from higher concentration to the lower concentration along with the fluid in convection. In dialysis, there is only a movement of solute from higher concentration to lower concentration. But in hemofiltration, there is some ability to purify albumin and enzymes. So the simplest analogy for hemodialysis is putting your tea bags into a water. So here, as you see, there is a diffusion of solutes from the tea bag into the water. So this is diffusion, and this is what happens in hemodialysis. So what happens in hemofiltration? The analogy is when you put when you're making a coffee making machine, where there is movement of solute along with water, isn't it? When you get the decoction, you get a solute along with water or melting of the ice. So this is what happens in hemofiltration. So what are the determinants of solute removal in dialysis? So there are four components which determine the clearance of solutes. So one is the size and surface area of the membrane we use in dialysis. So if you look at this, so you have a dialyzer, there are membranes. So the size and surface area of the membrane determines the exchange of solutes or clearance of solutes or clearance of the water, and the rate of ultrafiltrate flow. So the flow across the gradient, and water permeability, and this is transmembranous pressure. So the pressure gradient between the blood and the dialysate flow. I'll show in the next figure. So the dialysis circuit pretty much looks like this. So you have a patient's blood. So this is a patient's blood which goes into the dialysis filter, and there will be a dialysate which flows counter current. So if blood flows like this, dialysate will flow counter current, and because of the pressure gradient, there is exchange of solute from the higher gradient to the lower gradient, and there is movement of water also from the higher gradient to the lower gradient when you are doing hemofiltration. Okay, so this is how the whole circuit looks. So for all the trainees, I think this is a very important slide. How do you ascertain, or what are the different modalities of renal replacement therapy? So you have two major categories. One is continuous, one is intermittent. In intermittent, you have intermittent hemodialysis. So intermittent hemodialysis is one, any of the chronic kidney disease patient that is coming to your hospital for dialysis, they will be undergoing intermittent hemodialysis. And the second one is low efficiency dialysis or extended duration dialysis. This is typically you would see in ICU, where patients with AKI or AKI on CKD who come, where dialysis is initiated because of first time you would be initiating them and they would have hemodynamic instability. We'll put them on low efficiency dialysis. And the second category, so this is hemodialysis on the left. The second one is continuous. In continuous, you have peritoneal dialysis and continuous renal replacement therapy. So continuous renal replacement therapy, predominantly you will have filtration mechanisms. So you have all these different types. You would have heard of scuff, especially in heart failure or liver failure. We look at scuff. Scuff is nothing but slow continuous ultrafiltration. Basically, you're removing a lot of water content that is logged in the patient. Typically in typical heart failure, right ventricular failure. This is continuous arteriovenous hemofiltration or continuous veno-venous hemofiltration. This is continuous arteriovenous hemodialysis, continuous veno-veno hemodialysis, continuous arteriovenous hemodiafiltration, continuous veno-venous hemodiafiltration. Basically, all these components have fluid removal along with the solute removal. So understood? So this is the continuous and intermittent. So what is the difference between, so which one we should opt in intensive care or acute kidney injury, whether CRRT is better or whether SLED? See, SLED also can work as CRRT, which can remove water and which can remove solutes. So the advantage of CRRT is because it is a continuous renal replacement therapy which happens over 24 hours. So the volume removal is very slow, and solute removal also is slow, but it happens in a very gradual way and it is very hemodynamic friendly. Suppose you have a cardiogenic shock who is on a lot of vasopressors, or a liver transplant patient who is unstable, CRRT may be better because it has an ability to maintain the hemodynamic stability because it is a slow process which is happening over a long period of time. But the disadvantage is it is cost prohibitive because the whole dialysis part is happening for a 24-hour duration. the cost would be very high. As you see, the cost difference, they have looked at $1,602 versus $77 for intermittent hemodialysis. And you have to use a lot of heparin to keep the circuit viable. So, which means they're exposed to a lot of blood thinners, and it is labor intensive because a nurse has to be present on the bedside throughout the whole procedure because you can't leave it. So, what we use is SLED. So, intermittent hemodialysis is what typically happens in for a CKD patient. The advantage is there is a large volume removal in a short period of time. So, and disadvantage is because you're removing a lot of fluid in a short period of time, it can be hemodynamically, it can be challenging, and not all patients can tolerate. So, you would have very often see patients in dialysis crashing because of hypotension and they come to ICU. And the solute and volume removal is so erratic, and to have control over hemodynamic status can be difficult with intermittent hemodialysis. So, but what is a middle path? So, CRRT is very expensive and goes over 24 hours. Intermittent is very short. So, the middle path is SLED, slow low efficiency dialysis. As you see SLED, you see the blood flows at a little slower pace at 100 to 200 ml per minute. So, it is flowing in one direction, and dialysate flows counter current. It flows at 200 to 300 ml. That is much lower compared to the intermittent hemodialysis. There is a low solute clearance, and there is a low ultrafiltrate removal. And the advantage of SLED is you can prolong it. See, the SLED typically happens over 6 to 8 hours. You can prolong it to even to 12 hours, and you can convert it into even CRRT if needs be. You can convert it for extended period. So it becomes a little very similar to CRRT also. So it can be taken up for prolonged period of times to have more clearance, and it can be even done as a continuous process. And it is very easy to use because it has a touch screen, and it is very easy to adjust the flow rates. And as I said, it has a compatibility to alternate even between intermittent hemodialysis and SLED. If hemodynamically very friendly, you can use it even as intermittent hemodialysis. So many of my trainees, you would agree that many of the units would be using SLED, which is a middle path between CRRT and intermittent hemodialysis. And another advantage of SLED is the exposure to heparin is very less, and 40% of the times heparin may not be needed to maintain the viability of the circuit. So the conclusions of AKI. So this is the last slide. So AKI is common, and it's very common in ICU, and the occurrence rate is only increasing because of the age and the comorbid problems, and it's a serious complication of any critical illness that patients get admitted in ICU with, and it often signifies the onset of multi-organ dysfunction. And the early recognition of AKI is important by adopting Akin criteria or rifle. And Akin criteria is the easiest. You have stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Just look at the urine output. Less than 0.5 ml for 6 hours stage 1, 12 hours stage 2, and less than 0.3 ml or oliguria for 24 hours. If you remember that, I think that should be good enough for Akin criteria. And etiology in ICU, as you see, it is not one factor. It is always multifactorial, and there is always a complex interplay of all the diagram I showed you. It may be a complex interplay of hemodynamic status, electrolyte abnormalities, it may be a sepsis, it may be nephrotoxic drugs, or it may be to do with renal morphological abnormalities like calculi or post-obstructive reasons. So it is multifactorial, or hypoperfusion, hypotension, or systemic factors, or even cardiac cause. So you have to look into the light that there will be multiple factors, but there will be one overriding etiology which you need to address. So every other factor has to be looked into, and effective measures have to be taken to prevent further worsening. And the current trend is to initiate. So you wouldn't sit on the AKI until they become very acidotic or until the hyperkalemia manifests, because these are all okay for CKD. But in AKI, it is important that you look into the trends, and if there is worsening trends, to initiate early dialysis than waiting till hemodynamic compromise happens. So thank you very much. So I would end with this quote. So the person you will be in 5 years is based on the books you read and the people you surround yourself with today. So thank you. So if you have any questions, or if you want to rehear to this lecture, you can visit my website www.drpradeeprangappa.com to rehear to this lecture. So thank you.